You ever had to do a job or work around the house and you did not have the correct tool to do it? I don't know if I love doing projects around the house. I love doing different things around the house. I'm a DIYer, at heart. And in fact, I've realized that the older I get, the more I appreciate a good tool. In fact, I was working on my motorcycle the other day, and I was trying to do some different things, and I didn't have the right tool. And instead, I'll just put it this way: when I was younger, if I didn't have the right tool, I just made do with what I had. When I was younger, in my teens, in my 20s, or whatever, if I didn't have the hammer, I would just grab a wrench and I would just pound on the nail with a wrench. Or if I didn't have the right screw bit, I would just try to, whatever I had, whatever tool I had, I used. But as I got older, I realized that, when you have the right tool, it just sometimes makes it a lot easier, right? And so now I'm like, if I don't have the right tool, I'm like, Stacy, I'm going to go to the store. I'll be back, The Harbor Freight's right down the road. It's wonderful. In fact, I don't use wrenches or screwdrivers to hammer in nails anymore. I now use a hammer. It's amazing. It's this great tool. I don't just use any hammer, though. On my wall, I have 5 hammers. Because I don't know if you know this, but there's different hammers for different jobs. I've got my roofing hammer, I've got my curved claw, I've got my straight claw, I've got my backup straight claw. I have all these different hammers because I want the right tool for the right job. Sometimes you just have to use what you have. Actually, it's what I wasn't going to say this, but I'll just say it anyway. In my house, there's 2 different knives, 2 different types of knives in your drawer. If you ever open up your silverware drawer, there's called a steak knife, which has the little kind of teeth, and it's made to cut with, right? And then there's a butter knife, which is used to spread things with. I don't know why it drives me nuts, but sometimes there's someone in my house that likes to use steak knives to put butter on things. And they're like, it's just tearing up the bread. And I'm like, well, if you would use the right tool, it would work. There's something called a butter knife for butter. But sometimes you just have to use what you have. In fact, in the scripture we're going to look at today, the hero of the story, or the person that God uses to deliver the Israelites, didn't quite have the right tools that we would say, but just used what they had. In Judges, we're in Judges. We started a series in Judges a few weeks ago. And Judges is, like I said a couple weeks ago, it's a very interesting book. It's a different time in the Israelites' history, because at this moment right now, they have entered the promised land, but they have no king. God set it up for the nation of Israel. He said, look, I want to be your king. I want to be the King of Kings. I want to be your Lord of Lords. I want to rule over you. In fact, he said, here's some laws. Here's a covenant that I have with you. If you just follow my rules, allow me to be king, just follow my law, and everything will be great. That's it. It's that simple. He was like, just follow this, and you won't have to worry. Wouldn't that be nice? If it was just like, hey, just do this, and you would never have to worry about a thing. That's what God said. Just follow my laws, and you'll never have to worry about a thing. You don't need a king or anything like that. Well, the Israelites in this time, the judges, the theme throughout the book is this. They would follow God's laws for a little bit, and then it says they would decide to do what was right in their own eyes. They would decide to do their own thing. They would turn from God and they would start following other nations and other nations' gods and false idols. And they would do what was right in their own eyes instead of what is right in God's eyes. And so then God would hand them over to the nations around them. And they would be oppressed for a while, and they would be oppressed until they said, maybe we should follow God again. And they'd cry out to God. God would send a deliverer, a judge, a warrior that would help deliver them from the oppressor. And then they would follow God for a while. It would be good, and then repeat. This is over and over and over and over again that happens in the nation of Israel. And we started off just talking about, how do we thrive? How do we live in a world that does right in its own eyes? And we talked about passing it on to the next generation, passing the word of the Lord, passing our love for God on to the next generation. And then last week we looked at Ehud, the left-handed judge. Ehud, the left-handed judge, and we looked at how God can use our weakness. See, our weakness is God's strength. If people say, if you have a weakness, God says, I can use that and show off my strength. So we're going to pick up right after Ehud. In chapter 4, Judges chapter 4, verse 1 is where we're going to begin. Judges chapter 4, verse 1. Here we go. It says, after Ehud died, the Israelites, guess what? Once again did evil in the eyes of the Lord. So the Lord sold them into the hands of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in Harosheth Hagoyim. Because he had 900 iron chariots and had cruelly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years, they cried to the Lord for help. So it starts off again. It says, okay, here's the repeat cycle that we mentioned it over and over. In fact, by the end of Judges, you're going to be like, okay, Pastor Drew, we get it. Repeat. Here it is. Did evil. God hands him over to Jabin, whose commander is Sisera. And this little detail right there, the 900 iron chariots, is so important. Basically, that's saying that the iron chariot at that time was like the ultimate weapon. I know some people have compared it to like tanks these days, but tanks aren't even the ultimate weapon anymore. I mean, the iron chariots, basically, if you had iron chariots, you were in charge. You were unstoppable. And to have 900 of them meant you had such a large army, and you were so formidable that no one could stop you. You were unstoppable. And they were. And for 20 years, it says, 20 years they were cruelly oppressed. That cruelly oppressed word right there takes it to the next level. And beforehand, when we talked about Ehud at that time, they were just oppressed. They just had to bring tribute. It wasn't cruel, but there's something about this one that was cruel and unusual. Something about this ruler that did evil to them. That was above and beyond just, I'm going to rule you and you have to give me money. It doesn't say what it is. But whatever it was, it must have been bad. So here they are, and they cry out to God again. They cry out to the Lord Yahweh and say, help. In verse 4. Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lipidoth, was leading Israel at the time. She held court under the palm of Deborah because between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites came to her to have their disputes decided. So here we get Deborah. We introduce the judge of the time. She says she was a prophetess. She was a leader at the time. She's really, actually, as we study the book of Judges, she's the only judge that it talks about being in the role of a judge. She would sit under the palm of Deborah, it says, and people would come to her and she would say, this is God's will. This is how to fix this dispute. It's really interesting that she sat under this tree, which obviously was named after her. It wasn't probably called the tree of Deborah, and then she was like, oh, that's a nice tree. I'm going to sit under that one. But it's probably named after her because in those days, if you were a judge, Or in those days, if you were going to give, make judgments on disputes, it was the male elders that did that. And the male elders would sit at the city gate and make the judgments. So the elders of the city, the ones who were supposed to make the judgments according to them, would sit at the city gates and people would come to them and they would make judgments. That's where it was. It'd be like going to the courthouse. But not Deborah. Not Deborah. She sat under this palm tree and people came to her. Why? Because in those days, she wasn't really qualified to be the judge. It was the men of the city that were the judges. But God put the special call on her life and called her. And so instead of sitting at the city gates, she sat under the tree. You ever been in a role where people didn't think you were qualified? Did it stop you? John Wesley, the amazing evangelist, in fact, that's where Wesleyan comes from, the name. John Wesley was this amazing evangelist, and he wanted to preach to these coal miners in England. And he had a passion for them because they didn't know the Lord, and he would invite them to the church, but they were so dirty, they did not look the part of someone that would go to the church, that they were not allowed in the church. And that bugged John Wesley. He knew they needed to hear the word of the Lord. He knew they needed salvation. So instead of inviting them to church, instead of making them clean up to get into the church, John Wesley actually went out to the coal mines. And he would sit and he would preach the word of the Lord. He would preach and they would have revivals at the coal mine. And he would say, you know what, if the church won't let them in, then I will go to them. Deborah, not being able to sit at the city gate, it didn't stop her. She knew her calling. She knew she couldn't do it at the normal place in the normal way. So you know what? She found a tree. She sat under the tree, and people came. They knew she had the Spirit of God in her. They knew that she was a prophetess. So forget the elders at the gate. They came to her, and she would make judgments. She would help them decide between disputes. She would tell them what God was speaking. Now Deborah, here, verse 6, pick up. Deborah, she sent for Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kedesh, and said to him, the Lord, the God of Israel, commands you. Go take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun, and lead the way to Mount Tabor. I will lure Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his troops to the Kishon River, and give him into your hands. So we have the introduction of Deborah, and now we have this introduction of this man named Barak. And God had decided that Barak should be the deliverer of Israel. He was going to command an army. It doesn't say if he was already a commander. It doesn't tell us really much what he did as a living. He just said, God called him and said, you know what, this is what I want you to do. I want you to gather an army. I want you to get 10,000 men. A big army, and then I want you to go to this place, this valley, and I want you to take on Sisera. I want you to take on this commander. God said, I have chosen you, and I will also deliver you from your enemy. But this was a huge task. This was a big call. Because Barak knew the condition of Israel's army, and Israel's army at this time there was no army. They had been oppressed for 20 years. In fact, in the next chapter, Deborah sings a song. Not only was Deborah this amazing prophetess, not only was she this amazing judge, she was also an amazing singer, I guess. She wrote her own song. She had it all. But Deborah writes this song and kind of gives us this glimpse of what the army looked like for the Israelites. And it said this, no shields and no spears could be found for the Israelites. In other words, basically, it was a bunch of farmers with some pitchforks, and that's about it. Barak knew the condition of Israel's army. He knew the condition of Sisera's army. He knew that it had 900 chariots, iron chariots. He knew that it was unstoppable. So here's this man, and Deborah calls him. And God says, I want you to take 10,000. And I'm sure he was like, can I even find 10,000 people that are willing to do this? Because this is an impossible task. This is a suicide mission. This is crazy. This is huge. It's too big of a call. This is impossible. This is impossible to win. And he looked at the odds and he became hesitant. He looked at the odds and says, I don't know if this is possible. I was trying to come up with a good illustration, a good picture of what this would be like. Would someone say, okay, this is the 10,000 soldiers from Israel versus the 900 iron chariots plus all the soldiers that would be involved with that army. And I really could not come up with a good one other than this. This is what I came up with. It might be the worst illustration ever, okay? It'd be like this. It'd be like me going, you know what? I'm going to put a football team together. And I'm going to use everyone in here to put a football team together. So we're all going to put helmets on. We're going to put our shoulder pads on. We're going to put our uniforms on, right? I don't know. Maybe Jeff will be the quarterback. You can throw, right? You can still throw. There you go. Oh, we can split up duties. Whoever wants to be the running back, linemen, whatever you want to do. And then us putting a team together and say, okay, you know what? We're going to take on the Cincinnati Bengals. Yeah, I quit. Yeah. I hear it. You notice I didn't use the Browns as an illustration, right? I was staying away from them, yes. Yeah, who knows? Yeah, I set myself up for that. I totally deserve that. Yeah, pick your team, whatever. I mean, we would get crushed, right? We might have a couple of us that are like, okay, we can do a little bit, but man, that first time that 325-pound lineman hits us, we're done. Right? We'd say hike and I'd run the other way. I mean, that's the impossibility. It's ridiculous to think about, right? I mean, that is just so ridiculous. This is what God is calling Brock to do. He's saying, I want you to do something so ridiculous that it doesn't even make sense. I want you to get 10,000 men who doesn't even have shields, can't even find spears, and then I want you to take on this army that's impossible to stop. Here's Brock's answer. Brock said to her, if you go with me, I will go. If you go with me, I will go, but. In fact, you can underline just those words right there. But if you don't go with me, I won't go. He said this. He said, okay, I will obey. But only if you go with me. Because if you don't, I'm not going to obey. My obedience is going to be dependent on whether or not you come with me. He accepted that God called him, but there was something wrong. He didn't, maybe, I don't know what it was. Maybe he didn't even trust that anybody would show up. If he was like, you know what, if I go out there and say, hey, let's go fight the army, no one would be like, nope, I quit, right? Everyone would be like, nope, no way. So maybe he was like, maybe if I have Deborah with me, everyone loves Deborah, everyone will come out. Or maybe they're like, maybe he just needed some extra encouragement to obey. Or maybe he was like, you know what, if I go out there by myself, I don't think, God's going to protect me, but if I have Deborah right beside my side, I mean, she's the prophetess, she's the judge. God wouldn't let her die. I don't know the reason. I just know that there's a stipulation. He said, God, I will obey you, but only if this. He said, I will obey, but let me put a stipulation on my obedience. Let me ask you this question. Is it truly obedience if we put stipulations on it? is it truly obedience if we put stipulations on it? It'd be like this. I'll use this illustration. It'd be like if you have children in your house and you go, hey, it's time to clean your room. And they said, okay, I'll clean your room, but only if you help. Is that obeying? Or, hey, you know what? It's time to fold our mounds of laundry because I'm convinced that if you have children in your house, you have mounds of laundry. And if you don't tell me you don't, okay? I won't believe you. But it's like, okay, you have to do laundry. And they said, okay, I will do the laundry, but only if you get me ice cream afterwards. Is that obeying? Is that obeying even if they actually start doing the laundry? Is that obeying if they put stipulations on their obedience? Because there's the thing, God calls us to amazing things. God calls us to do so much stuff, so many things in life that actually frees us. But many times when we're called to do things like that, we put a stipulation on our obedience. God says, I want you to forgive. I want you to forgive that person that hurt you. I have called you to forgive the person that was mean to you, cruel to you, hurt you, offended you, whatever. Fill in it. I want you to forgive. And we say, God, I'll forgive, but only if they apologize first. God, I'll forgive, but only if you make sure that they fill it in the blank. I'll obey, but here's my stipulation. God says, go share my word. Go tell people about me. Go show love to everyone around you. And he's like, okay, I will show love. I will share your word, but only if you make it really easy. God says, I want you to live a generous life. I want you to tithe. I want you to give. And you say, okay, God, I will do that. I will do that. Okay, I will obey, but only if you, let me win the lottery. Give me this job. God says, I want you to go. I want you to go do this. I want you to start this ministry. I want you to do this. And you say, okay, God, I will do that only if we just bring it down to the basic, God says, I want you to follow me. Jesus says, come follow me. And we fight it and we say, God, Jesus, I will follow you. But you need to do this first before I follow you. Before I become your follower, you need to do this in my life. And we put a stipulation on our obedience. How many times do we get out of obeying, or do we try to get out of obeying by putting stipulations on our obedience? It's exactly what Barak is doing right now. Now here's the answer. Here's what happened. Ready? Very well, Deborah said. He puts a stipulation, and she goes, okay, that's fine. I will go with you, but because of the way you're going about this, basically she's saying, but because you're not doing it the way God wanted you to do it, because you've put a stipulation on this, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will hand Sisera over to a woman. So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh, where he summoned Zebulun and the Naphtali. 10,000 men followed him, and Deborah also went with him. So she said, okay, I'll go, but the honor's going to go to a woman. I'm sure he thought this. I'm sure he thought, well, you know what? I know who it's going to go to. It's going to go to you, Deborah, and I don't care because you're coming with me. We summarize what happens in the next several verses. They go to battle. The next chapter tells us what the battle looks like. They go to this battle. They have this huge army with all these chariots, and they have this small little army with the Israelites who really don't know how to fight. And before they fight, it says that the earth rumbled. There's rain, a torrential rain. There was downpours, and basically it made the iron chariots useless. God himself routed Sisera's army. God himself stopped the chariots, stopped everything, and he won he won the victory. He handed Sisera over to Barak and the 10,000 men. So they win. Sisera's army is defeated. And Sisera runs. I'm going to pick up in verse 17. So that's what happens in those verses in between. Just basically, God wins the battle for them. They don't even have to really fight. I mean, they just have to chase them. Sisera, however, fled on foot to the tent of Jael because his iron chariot was stuck. So he got out and he runs. He runs on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, because there were friendly relations between Jebin the king of Hazar and the clan of Heber the Kenite. Jael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, "Come, my lord, come right in. Don't be afraid." So he entered her tent, and she put a covering on him. This is basically what happens. Sisera runs. In verse 11, it tells that there's this distant relative of Moses. He lived in his own place, who was friends with the king. So Sisera runs, he meets this little tribe. And Jael sees him and says, "Hey, come into my tent. Hide in here. Because if you hide in here, no one's going to look for you." Because it was not appropriate, it was not acceptable to go into a woman's tent. So he would go in there, and she was like, "No one's going to look for you in here because you're not supposed to be in here." So it was supposed to be a safe place. So he hides in there. She covers him up with a blanket because I'm sure he's exhausted. You ever wondered what you can do with milk, a tent peg, and a hammer? Remember how I said that sometimes you don't have the right tool for the right job, and you just have to use what you have? Well, this is the part of the story that when I was in middle school, this was one of my favorite parts, because it's so gross and so weird. He says, "I'm thirsty," he said. "Please give me some water." But instead of water, she opened up a skin of milk. She gave him a drink and covered him up. Nothing like some nice warm milk to make you go to sleep. "Stand in the doorway of the tent," he told her. "If someone comes by and asks you, 'Is anyone here?' say no." But Jael, Heber's wife, picked up a tent peg and a hammer and went quietly to him while he lay fast asleep, exhausted. And then she drove the peg through his temple into the ground, and he died. Ew. Barak came by in pursuit of Sisera, and Jael went to meet him and said, "Come," she said, "I will show you the man you're looking for." So he went in with her, and there lay Sisera with a tent peg through his temple, dead. And on that day, God subdued Jabin, the Canaanite king, before the Israelites. What can you do with milk, a tent peg, and a hammer? How about you can deliver the Israelites from their cruel oppressors? Jael wasn't a warrior. She didn't have a sword. She didn't have a shield. She was helpless, yet she was available to God. She was willing to use whatever she had to obey God. In fact, the title of this little passage right here in my Bible says Deborah. I think the little title of it should have been like God delivers a nation using some milk, a tent peg, and a hammer. Instead of using Barak to deliver the Israelites, God chose one who was willing to say yes. She did not say, "Yes, God, but this first." There was no stipulations. She just took what was in her hands, and she said, "Okay." When God calls us, He has already given us what we need to do His will. He has already made a way to provide along the way. Over and over in Scripture, God does this. God calls, and it doesn't look like what they have is enough to do His will, but God makes it enough. I mean, there was a little boy with a slingshot that took on a giant and delivered the nation. There was a little boy in Scripture that had some fish and some bread, and guess what? Jesus used to feed thousands and thousands of people. Moses was arguing with God, and God says, "What's in your hand?" He says, "All I have is a staff." And God says, "That's enough. Just use what is in your hand." God has provided for you, and you are called to use what He has provided to serve Him. Whether you have a wrench trying to put in a nail, or you have 5 hammers hanging up saying, "Which one am I going to use?" God is not looking for the most skilled person. God isn't looking for the most amazing, perfect person. God isn't looking for the best looking person. God isn't looking for the most outgoing person or the best personality. He doesn't care. God uses ordinary people going about their ordinary lives to do his greatest work. And the only criteria is being willing and available. That's it. God wants to use each and every one of us in here for his will. He wants to use it for his glory, and we just need to be willing and available. God is looking for those who are just willing to say yes. Yes, God, I will use what you have given me, and I may not have a lot, but what I have is yours. And when you call me, the answer is yes. This week I had the opportunity for our LifeWise Academy. There was a group from Kettering that came up, and the group from Winchester that are interested in starting LifeWise in their school districts. And so they came to look at our building, to give a tour, to just get all this information about LifeWise and see if they can start it in their community. And so I had the opportunity to meet with these people. We were going, I gave them a tour of the building that we have back there, and just they got to observe a class. And one of the people was just so excited about it, and he was just so amazed. And in the conversation, he said this. He was like, listen, thank you for building this building. Thank you for doing this. He said, tell your church thank you because you are blessing and changing this community. He said, thank you. I said, well, it wasn't me. It wasn't us. It was God. God did this. And he said, yes, God did this. But you guys were willing to say yes. So when God called, you said yes. And he's like, and God is using this in amazing ways. And then I was reminded, and I reminded him, I said, you know what? The easiest way, the easiest thing to do is to say yes. It really wasn't hard. The easiest, most blessed way is just to say yes and let God do his will in our lives. It's not difficult. It's difficult when we want to control what we're doing. It's difficult when we want to have control over our lives. But when we finally go all in, for Jesus said, I'm all in for you, yes. Whatever you want, yes. Then it's the easiest thing in the world. Ask our worship team to come forward. I want to conclude with this. What are you battling God on? What is God asking you to do that you're putting stipulations on? What is it that he's saying, I want you to do this, I want you to do this, and you're saying, yes, God, okay, I will obey, but, and you put a stipulation on it. Yes, but only if you do this. I don't know, maybe it's forgiving someone. Maybe it's loving someone, or maybe it's a change in your life that God is saying, I need you to change this, say yes, but this, or maybe it's an addiction that he's like, I need you to give this up, and you're like, yes, but God, only if this, and you're putting a stipulation on obedience, and God just says, I just want yes. Just say yes. Oh, maybe it's just following him for the first time. Maybe God's been calling you and saying, I need you, I want you to follow me. And you could keep putting a stipulation on it, and God says, now's the time just to say yes. I'm all in. God, I am all in for you. This is what I have, and it's yours. Whatever it is this morning, it's time to say yes. Let's stand and let's just finish worshiping our Lord.